Speaking today on the 34th day of a partial government shutdown.
So unimportant in the lives of the American people in terms of especially those who are victims of the shutdown, hostages to the president's applause line in a campaign speech. Thank goodness we put that matter to rest, and then we can get on to the subject at hand. Open up government so that we can negotiate how best to protect our borders. Democrats have always been strong about honoring our oath of office to protect and defend the American people. Protecting our borders, securing our borders is an important part of that. Today, the Senate has an opportunity to pass legislation that is very simple. It's about billions of dollars in disaster assistance and also just keeping government open until February 8th so that we can have a discussion while people are being paid. Tomorrow marks the second paycheck that our federal workers will miss. We've asked the Republicans to take yes for an answer over and over again. And the legislation that we passed yesterday, this week, we have a little more than $500 million for the ports of entry. We have been told by authorities that 90% of the drugs come through the port of entry. We also know that those seeking amnesty are encouraged to come through the ports of entry, and most of them do. And that is a place where we can secure our borders for the purpose of, again, not security, but also immigration, trade, travel, tourism, and the rest. And so in that legislation, we have over $500 million to build the infrastructure to secure, to enhance and perhaps even increase the number of ports of entry. That is not in the Homeland Security bill because it falls under the Treasury Department independent agencies bill that we passed on the floor this week. We have over $500 million for additional immigration judges. This is to address the backlog of processing immigration cases. And then, those seeking asylum. An asylum is a humanitarian effort for all of us. The evangelicals have testified in our rump hearings before we had the majority to have a real hearing. They've testified that the U.S. refugee resettlement program, how we deal with asylum seekers, is the crown jewel of American humanitarianism. And again, that is being undermined. And these ports of entry, increasing them, will be helpful. But asylum seekers can cross wherever they can. That is under international law. Okay, third, then assistance to Central America country. These three things really actually were in the president's proposal the other day. So this is not different. We have been advocating this for a while. The president adopted some of these things in his statement the other day, and yet the Republicans refuse to support a Homeland Security bill that includes that. And it's not when I say a Homeland Security bill, it isn't the actual Homeland Security, it's a bill to open government. It's for the 6 other bills to open government, which contain some port of entry language. Today, the Senate will vote on a bipartisan bill to open government. It contains the same funding proposal they've already supported, and yet now they won't. So there's no excuse for Senate Republicans not to pass this legislation. We've asked them over and over again to take yes for an answer. So we're very firm in our support on how we secure our borders. Let's have that discussion after we open up government, and then let us get to work. You've heard the letters from the former secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security saying this is harmful, open up government. You've heard from the FBI Agents Association that because of the shutdown, they have no funds to pay confidential sources or to pay for investigation and prosecution of cases, including child exploitation, cyber warfare, or MS-13 terrorism-related cases. You've heard from the air traffic controllers, pilots, and flight attendants warn that we have a growing concern for safety and security. We cannot even calculate the level of risk currently or at play, nor predict the point at which the entire system will break, I heard him, the president of the Association of the Flight Attendants, Air Traffic Controllers, last night say that in one place, 40% of the people, there's only 52% of the workforce there, of 100% that they should have. And of that 52%, 40% are eligible for retirement. This is not something about re-upping when you see how casually this administration treats the important work that air traffic controllers do for us. And then the Commandant of the Air Force, the Coast Guard, Admiral Carl Schultz, said, "I find it unacceptable that the Coast Guard men and women have to rely on food pantries and donations to get through the day-to-day life as service members." That's this Commandant of the Coast Guard. He's saying that he finds it unacceptable. That should be a call to action for this administration to open up government. Instead, what do they have? They have Wilbur Ross saying he doesn't understand why. When he was asked about people going into food lines and pantries and the rest, he says he doesn't understand why they have to do that. I don't know, is this the let them eat cake kind of attitude, or call your father for money, or this is character building for you? It's all going to end up very well, just as long as you don't get your paychecks. I don't quite understand why, as hundreds of thousands of men and women are about to miss a second paycheck tomorrow. I met with the mayors yesterday, and in addition to speaking with them, I've heard from them about all of the stories and what it means in their communities in terms of the individual families, but also the impact on the economies of their communities. We wanted to work together to get back to work, to lower the cost of health care for all Americans, to increase the paychecks by building infrastructure, what the president says he wants to do, and to move on with our H.R. 1 to bring dignity and reduce the role of big, dark, special interest money in politics. We are working on these initiatives. We hope that we can open government so that we can fully concentrate in this way. And in that case, we urge the president once again, thank you for recognizing that it's inappropriate to have a State of the Union address where people are working hard, very hard, to protect all of us in that room and not getting paid for it. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
How hard are you pushing the White House for another face-to-face meeting with the president? I mean, how do you work this out if you don't sit down and talk
Get through?
Well, we have met. We've met every time. The last time we met, it was a photo op for the president to leave the room. But they know full well that we're here in order to have any conversations.
Do you think that would be valuable? I mean, it's been more than a week now since you've spoken face-to-face.
It's the President of the United States. We meet with him any time he wants to meet, and I've never discouraged anybody from meeting with the President. Yes, Dick.
So on the shutdown, you sent your initial letter when the government was shut down, and then you said that yesterday we're not going to have your speech until we're not going to pass a concurrent resolution. The President sent out his statement last night. You sent out your tweet. The government was shut down at both points. Did something change between when you sent the initial letter because the government was shut down at that point?
Yeah, I really appreciate your question. That was the first day of the session of Congress, and that very same day, we passed the legislation that was passed overwhelmingly by the Republicans in the Senate. We're saying we're giving you back just exactly what you gave us. Take yes for an answer. They didn't. Now 10 times the House Democrats have passed legislation to open up government. In between then and now, I said to the president, we should find a mutually agreeable date when government is open to do this. So what has changed is that the Senate has refused to take yes for an answer, and maybe today they will do too, because what we passed this week was you give me an opportunity to say this. We first sent them what they did, pure and simple Senate Republican leadership legislation. They said no. They said no. Why would they say no when they passed it 92-6, in some cases 100 unanimously in committee, and sometimes with the vote of Mitch McConnell because he's an appropriator? The Republicans on this side said, why would we just pass something the Senate did when we negotiated these bills and we have our conferences on them? So we said, okay, this week we'll bring up the bills as conferenced, House and Senate. Still, they said no. We gave them what they asked for, and still not enough Republicans voted for. But we had the votes to pass it in the House, and that's another thing that the Senate could take up. But today is simple. It's about $12 billion for disaster assistance plus 2 weeks of open up government. Who can say no to that? So that for 2 weeks we can have this debate.
So when you sent the initial letter, you didn't think the government would still be shut down?
No, I did not. I did, especially since we were giving them back exactly what they gave us. I guess I had better hopes for the concern that the Republicans in the Senate might have for the concerns of working people in our country. Let's see. Yes,
House Democrats are
Katie?
behind the scenes a counteroffer.
That's not true. That's not true.
If
that's not true.
What are the status of the
No,
negotiations? Are you considering something like that?
No, we are doing what we have been doing all along. We have been working on our congressional responsibility to write bills, appropriations bills, to keep government open. Many of those bills have come to the floor again and again just this week. The Homeland Security bill was not finished. Hopefully it will be finished soon, and out of that, you will see our commitment to border security. That's not any negotiation behind the scenes or anything like that.
Is it not the case then that you guys are working on a $5.7 billion bill that would not include money for the wall, but would include money for border?
Within our $49 billion Homeland Security bill, there will be some provisions. You heard about $1.5 billion that I just said here that are not within that bill. They're in the Treasury Department, they're in the Justice Department, I don't know what they call it anymore. When I was ranking Democrat, it was called Foreign Ops, but that Foreign Ops State Department bill. So that's $1.5 billion. But within separate from that is the Homeland Security bill, and within that we will have some of our proposals for what comes next. That's great. Yes, sir.
Speaker, why not keep your members here this weekend?
Many of them will be here. Many of them will be here. Some of them will be home listening to the stories and commiserating with those who have lost their jobs. As you probably know, while people think of the Washington area as the place where most federal employees are, they are in fact indeed all over the country, in my district as well. And some will be here this afternoon. We'll have some after the Senate acts, hoping that they could accept $12 billion for disaster assistance in 2 weeks to open up government, to end the shutdown so that we can negotiate. If that doesn't happen, we'll be telling the stories of these families. So some will be here, some won't be here, but all of them on notice to be here.
Day 35, why not be in session?
Well, if we have some vote that we can take, we will be in session. It is not a closed case, but I'm still optimistic. I'm still optimistic in the goodness of the Republicans in the Senate, that they will care enough about these people that they will say, okay, we'll give 2 weeks so that we can negotiate a evidence-based, cost-effective, value-respecting way to protect the American people with border security. That doesn't seem like a big ask, especially since we still need to pass the disaster assistance. That's a simple ask. Senators, I don't think we can speak to them in that way. My hope is that the senators will pass a bill that addresses the concerns of the disaster assistance, $12 billion. We need to pass that legislation, A, and B, 2 weeks, February 8th, short period of time, open up government, let the negotiations continue or begin at a certain stage so that we can honor the work that these people are doing, deflect those on the Republican side who want to shrink government, and this is one way to engineer that. be respectful of how we are protected by our civil aviation and the security that the FBI provides for us in so many ways that are shut down because they just don't understand why people have to stand in food lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we just been listening to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, talking about the road forward. And of course, the Senate will be looking at two proposals to open the government. Neither of them are expected to pass, but one is a Republican-led proposal that would give the president the $5 billion in funding for a border wall that he's asking for. The other one is a Democratic-led proposal that's already passed in the House, moving on to the Senate, that would supply the government with enough money to stay open until the beginning of February 8th, I think, but no money for a border wall. Neither of those are expected to go anywhere at all today. But, you know, in talking to our Major Garrett earlier today and yesterday, one of the things that you have to sort of be heartened by is the fact that they are actually talking, at least the two groups are talking. We heard our Nancy Cordes asking Nancy Pelosi whether or not she would be meeting with the president, and she sort of said, you know, if the president wants to meet, he's the president, we'll meet with him. I'm not going to discourage anybody from meeting with him, that she's open to a meeting. This all comes, of course, on the heels of the president announcing that he will postpone the State of the Union address until after the government is open. That came after a very public sort of tit for tat between the Speaker and the president. The Speaker initially asking the president to consider not having the State of the Union. The president sort of insisting that he was going to go forward with some sort of speech, and then ultimately the Speaker of the House saying you do not have permission to go forward, not in the House chamber, and then the president sort of agreeing to that. So anyways, Nancy Cordes has been down there with Speaker Pelosi. And Nancy, you were in the room. I heard you asking her about whether or not there were any plans for her to meet with the president at all in the next few days, and she sort of bounced that ball around in the air.
Right. I mean, that's been one of the very unusual features of this shutdown, is that normally when the government is shut down or facing some other kind of crisis, you see leaders constantly shuttling back and forth, both here on Capitol Hill, between the Democratic and Republican leadership offices, or between Capitol Hill and the White House. And that has been notably missing during much of this shutdown. The Speaker met with the president more than a week ago. You may recall that was the very brief meeting where Speaker Pelosi and Leader Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, said that the president, shortly after the meeting started, slammed his hand on the table and walked out when Pelosi said that she was not going to be supportive ever of border wall funding. So, you know, at this point, my question was essentially aimed at, you know, what's happening? You know, everyone talks about how concerned they are about these federal workers, but Speaker Pelosi notably declined twice to say that she is pushing aggressively to get back to the White House to meet with the president. And the president himself has said, you know, I'm waiting here for Democrats to come talk to me. So nobody making the first move. And yes, while there are votes that are taking place today, they're partisan votes. And, you know, they may garner a couple of yes votes from the other side, but they are not an indication of some outbreak of bipartisanship leading us towards a solution imminently. And that is, again, something that is so bizarre about a shutdown that everyone says they want to end.
Yeah, indeed. You know, you talked about the two bills that are probably going to go nowhere at all. But earlier we were talking about whether or not there is a little bit of a silver lining. If the leaders are not meeting, the leaders of the parties are not meeting with the president, at least though there is some conversation about ideas to get the government open.
I suppose, although, you know, these bills that they're voting on today are the product of conversation within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. It's not any evidence of the two sides talking to each other, which is really what you need to have happen in order for the government to be reopened. So there's a Republican bill, that's going to fail. There's a Democratic bill, that's going to fail. The real test here will be if after that happens, you then start to see more robust conversations between the leaders of both parties trying to find a solution here.
You know, we talked about this, I think, perhaps last week or maybe earlier this week about the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. What is going on with him? You know, he had really been sort of spearheading some of these bills before, whether it was funding the wall or not funding the wall, just keeping the government open. But he was really sort of rallying his party members, and now we don't hear anything. Is there a lot of work happening behind the scenes?
Not really. I mean, Leader McConnell got pretty burned at the very start of this process by the White House. He held a vote that was supposed to be non-controversial right before the holidays to fund the government. It was supported unanimously by the Senate. They all left town. And then the president essentially dug in and said no, that he wants border wall funding to the tune of $5.7 billion. That's something that was not in the Senate plan. And they thought that he was going to be okay without it. It turned out that he wasn't. And so that was a sign early on that Leader McConnell and the president were not necessarily on the same page, and that McConnell couldn't be an effective negotiator on behalf of the White House if he wasn't in lockstep with the president. You know, perhaps it's a tall order for anyone to be completely in lockstep with the president, because there have been times throughout this process where Republicans thought they knew what he wanted, only to discover that actually he was more dug in than they even expected. And that is a big part of the reason that you've seen McConnell sort of taking a back seat, at least up until now.
Yeah, there's no win there. Nancy, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we're going to take everyone to the Senate floor, where Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is speaking now. Let's take a listen.
That equally codifies the president's position that government funding is a bargaining chip, that essentially codifies, it's a harshly partisan proposal that essentially codifies the president's position that government funding is a bargaining chip. A vote for the president's plan is an endorsement of government by extortion. If we let him do it today, he'll do it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The whole structure of our government will change, and the chaos that we now see will be magnified. Even some of my Republican friends have admitted the president's plan's not a serious offer. A few days ago, my friend from Oklahoma called it, quote, a straw man proposal, unquote. I think that says it all. The president's plan is a straw man, not a serious offer, merely a way to save face. The second vote is the opposite. It demands nothing before we reopen the government. Nothing. No partisan demands. Not things we want, or we'll shut down the government. We don't do that. Only Trump does that, and our Republican colleagues go along. Our proposal allows us to open up the government, and then after government's open, settle our differences over border security. I know it's not partisan, because every single Republican supported the same basic idea just 1 month ago when we voted on it. And when President Trump changed his mind and said no, everyone sort of did a 180-degree reversal, including my friend, the Republican leader. He knows it. So the two votes are not the same. They are not flip sides of the same coin. The first vote is harshly partisan and one-sided. The second vote seeks to be down the middle and reopen government, and has received overwhelming support from both sides before President Trump said he wouldn't do it. Calling the two votes equivalent is not an attempt just to simplify, but to mislead. Nonetheless, in a few hours, we'll take these two votes. The Senate will have a chance to say no to the president's hostage-taking, and then the Senate will have a chance to send a clear message that Congress is ready to reopen the government. To my Republican colleagues, even if you're for the wall, all of those who have said, I may be for the wall, but I want to keep the government open, have a chance to do it on the second vote. Let's see how they vote. Throughout this debacle, I have not heard one good reason why 800,000 federal employees must be held hostage for us to discuss border security. Democrats are happy to discuss border security under regular order with the government open. We support stronger border security. President Trump believes the best way to do that is an expensive and ineffective wall. We disagree sharply over that, but there's no reason we can't negotiate and figure it out. What we cannot allow is the president to hijack our government and hold it hostage every time we disagree over policy, which he will do if he wins this time. The votes this afternoon are about more than just a shutdown. They're about how we govern in a democracy. We're allowed to come here and disagree over policy. In fact, our system of government was designed to allow for progress despite our large and sometimes raucous differences. But when one side, in this case the president, throws a temper tantrum and uses the basic functioning of our government as leverage in a policy argument, our system of government breaks down. If every president decided to shut down the government when they didn't get a policy from Congress, America would careen from crisis to crisis, an endless spiral of gridlock and dysfunction. So the votes this afternoon are not about border security. These votes are about ending a manufactured crisis, a self-inflicted wound that is bleeding our country out a little more each day. And I hope, I pray, the Senate rises to the occasion. I yield the floor.
So we've just been listening to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. The Senate is planning on voting on two measures that, if passed, if either of them pass, they would then result in the opening of the government. The likelihood of them passing pretty low, but one is democratically led. The other one is led by the Republicans. The Republican one would fund the border wall. The democratically led one would fund the government just until the beginning of the month to give some leeway and some relief for those 800,000 workers who are not getting paid, to give them a little bit of a break while the border security would be negotiated. But like I said, and like we've been saying all day, the likelihood of either of those bills going anywhere is pretty much zero. So Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is addressing the latest tensions in the unrest in Venezuela. Here's what he said at a special meeting at the Permanent Council of the Organization of the American States moments ago.
That the tyranny of the now defunct Maduro regime has for far too long, choked the country and its citizens. Yesterday, in solidarity with the Venezuelan people, and out of respect for Venezuelan democracy, the United States proudly recognized National Assembly President Juan Guaido